Game Freak has definitely been under fire lately, but rather than talk about their recent questionable decisions, I want to talk about a long-standing problem that's directly influenced the coining of the term Genwunner. Now, the term Genwunner is interpreted by a portion of the community as if it's derogatory, when it really comes across as more of the doo-doo head insult on the internet playground. Those who take Genwunner as personally offensive tend to place blame on the newer Pokemon concepts being unimaginative or nonsensical. Those who use Genwunner as an insult will easily point out cop-out designs of older Pokemon, but simultaneously admit to blindly following the franchise as if it can do no wrong. Both of these arguments point the finger at the Pokemon concepts, but completely ignore the objective change the franchise has seen, not necessarily in conceptual design, but in art style. This gradual change in style has created this divide among fans, which is perpetuated by Game Freak and its inability to experiment outside of a linear design path. Pokemon's overall change in image is apparent, but the fact that it's an art style change is not apparent to most. A recent Reddit post by Edelheart put this exact change to words and blew the minds of Redditors everywhere with almost 61,000 upvotes. This post shows that new Pokemon concepts aren't the dividing issue among fans, but rather the art style in which they are portrayed. These individual renditions of newer Pokemon exhibit the same core design, yet manage to create an entirely different feeling of dimension and depth by emulating the art style of earlier generations. This method done in reverse again shows the art style simply exaggerates certain features and proportions which aren't indicative of poor character design, but rather a stylistic one that leans toward simplicity. The push towards cuter and simpler features does, however, make them less appealing to wider audiences. Older Pokemon fans are a demographic that typically falls into this category, as they grew up with a style showcasing sharper lines and more tangible depth to the depictions of these pocket monsters. Compare that to the 2D renditions of newer Pokemon, and they appear to be more rooted in the second dimension by their smoother curves or features which don't take profile into account. Whether this is due to an intentional art direction or to simplify the process of animation or 3D modeling, it's a very divisive change that creates an objectively stark contrast between different generations of Pokemon. The change is not generationally exclusive either, as we can find huge design changes in Pokemon's flagship mascot, Pikachu. If any Pokemon were to showcase the gradual change in art direction the series has taken, it's this one. Even when the Alolan versions revisited some of the iconic first-generation Pokemon like Raichu, the art change was clear. So why is this a problem? Pokemon is not the only video game series to see a stylistic change over time. However, they are one of the few that refuses to change. For whatever reason this might be, this shows either an inability to acknowledge the voices of a large portion of their audience, an inability to take risks, or both. Take Halo, for example. The original trilogy made by Bungie has a completely different look and feel than the second run made by 343 Industries. The earlier games were forced to run on drastically lower specs by today's standards, but it gave the series a simple yet gritty look that was identifiably Halo. Halo 4 and 5 were given to us with a much busier and sometimes off-putting art style comparatively. Many fans were outspoken on their distaste for the new style, as the series made a drastic change in art direction that felt removed from what fans grew up with. 343 obviously heard these fans, with Halo Infinite's trailer exhibiting a beautiful next-gen look that still harkens back to the classic defining look that Halo set almost 20 years ago. Now, simply going back to a classic art style isn't always the right answer, and I'm not saying Pokemon needs to do that. While I personally enjoy the fact that Halo is entertaining their old art style once again, I would argue that the Zelda series has handled their art style throughout the years even better. The Wind Waker is loved by a lot of Zelda fans, but not many people remember how poorly the game was received back in the day. The game was regularly cited as too childish and cartoony, and I knew many who didn't pick up the game at the time simply because they didn't like how it looked. This makes sense. Take a look at Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask, which were the console Zeldas beforehand. The art style change was so jarring that anyone unfamiliar with the series may not be able to place them in the same franchise. It seems like Nintendo took note of this, as Twilight Princess was again a drastic change of tone. This series grew with the ages, and when it hit a snag, they decided to take it a completely new direction with its art style. Sure, Zelda games are largely the same premise at their core, but a new art style and tone not only give each game a new feel, but the potential to appeal to an entirely new demographic that other styles just can't. Now, I can't say the wider franchise hasn't made any changes in the art style, as the anime made one very prominent, very controversial change in style for Sun and Moon. Many fans said it was too cartoony or doodly, and it may go down in history as the Wind Waker of the Pokemon animes. But I have to give the team behind the animation credit for taking that risk. Pokemon has been making a gradual shift to the more cartoony for some time now, but at least this was an objective change of form. Unfortunately, it looks like they'll be going right back to what's safe in the upcoming movie, and this brings me back to my issue with the overall design path Pokemon has decided to take. Game Freak's inability to shift art styles shows many issues, the first being a large disconnect from a vocal portion of their fanbase, and one that I would argue isn't necessarily a vocal minority. Pokemon Go launching with only Generation 1 Pokemon shows a huge demographic of old Pokemon fans were brought back into the game. Even if it was solely out of nostalgia, their value as a paying customer base is reason enough to legitimize this group as a whole. Rather than experiment with a new art style or tonal direction that appeals to a larger group of fans, the only attempts we've seen are things like Alolan versions of Generation 1 Pokemon, which can be interpreted as a cash grab at millennials, which still fails due to their art style. Furthermore, attempting to cater toward this group of older fans in very obtuse ways is very apparent to the newer, more involved fans who see this as the Genwunner fan service that it is. I would argue that the inability to venture outside of a progressively simplifying art style is what creates this toxic reaction among some members of the Pokemon community. Without any attempts on Game Freak's end to breach the gap, each side of the community is left to put up their walls and continue flailing the same baseless arguments at each other. Those who label themselves as true Pokemon fans are simply blind consumers that will eat up anything Game Freak hands them while laughing at these simple-minded Genwunners. Meanwhile, these older, more removed fans are also unable to recognize it as a change in art style, but just continue to claim the same thing like Pokemon look like Digimon now, without realizing that many designs of the older generations were inherently flawed. But ignoring the community divide, and worst of all, this is showing Game Freak's inability to innovate, despite Pokemon being one of the highest grossing franchises of all time. Outside of the special split that we saw in Generation 4, we haven't received any major changes outside of a shift toward 3D models. And from what we've seen from the jump from 3DS to the Switch, this leaves me worried that Pokemon will soon turn into the Call of Duty of Nintendo, if it hasn't already. You can look at any other video game franchise that has seen a stylistic change over time, and it becomes commonplace to see people rally around different eras or styles. Ask any Zelda fan which game was their favorite, and you will get wildly different yet passionate responses, despite the fact that they know you'll probably disagree. I want that for Pokemon as well, but if Game Freak isn't going to change anything, the community needs to recognize that an objective change in style means many will prefer one look over the other. At the end of the day, it's a preference based on very real differences. If you made it this far, thank you for listening. I know this is a contentious topic within the Pokemon community, but I hope my views help to explain the fanbase's very strong opinions. For the record, some of my favorite Pokemon designs have come from the last two games, but that does not stop me, personally, from greatly preferring the art styles of the old days. If you don't absolutely hate me after this video, please consider clicking the subscribe button for me. I cover everything from Pokemon to Magic the Gathering, and I have plenty of new videos planned for the future, so if you'd stick around and click that button, it would really mean a lot. Thank you for watching, and I still have no idea how to end a video.